Please, just take it, Maya. I'm warm, I promise. I don't even feel the wind anymore. Just put it on and stay close to me." These were the words of a 10-year-old boy named Leo, whispered through blue, trembling lips as he stripped off his only protection against a Chicago blizzard. He wasn't just giving his sister a piece of denim, he was giving her his very life, one shiver at a time. Watch this until the very end, because what happens next will change your perspective on what true wealth really means. After the story, please drop a comment below with a rating from 0 to 10 for this journey, and if this story touches your heart, subscribe to the channel to support my work. I'm counting on you. The wind in Chicago doesn't just blow in January, it hunts. It moves through the skyscrapers like a predator, searching for any gap in a window, any frayed seam in a coat, or any unprotected soul to settle into the bone. It is a city of steel and ice, a place where the skyline reaches for the heavens, while the streets often feel like a forgotten purgatory. Inside a climate-controlled Maybach shielded by 3 inches of reinforced glass and the finest German engineering, sat Arthur Sterling. At 65, Arthur was a man whose name was synonymous with that very steel. He was the architect of a multi-billion-dollar empire, a titan of industry who had spent 40 years turning a small construction firm into a global behemoth. His hands, once calloused from laying bricks, were now manicured and soft, usually wrapped around a crystal glass of scotch or a high-stakes contract. But as Arthur stared out at the blurred grey world of the South Side, he didn't feel like a king. He felt like a ghost. His penthouse on the Magnificent Mile was a masterpiece of glass and marble, a cathedral to his own success, but it had become a mausoleum. He had everything money could buy, vintage cars, rare art, the ear of the governor, and yet he had nothing that made a life worth living. He was a man who had won the world and lost his own reflection. His only constant companion was a memory that refused to fade, a ghost that had haunted him for 4 decades. Her name was Sarah. She was his younger sister, the only person who had ever truly loved him for who he was, not for the digits in his bank account. They had been lost to the foster care system in Queens 40 years ago, separated on a rain-slicked porch by a social worker who told them it was for the best. Arthur had promised to find her. He had promised to protect her, but the world is a large place for a boy with no money, and by the time he had the resources to look, the trail had gone cold. Sarah was gone, and the guilt had frozen Arthur's heart more effectively than any Chicago winter ever could. The Maybach began to slow, the hum of the engine dropping to a low purr as the car became mired in a gridlock near a desolate stretch of the South Side. A water main had burst a few blocks ahead, turning the street into an ice rink and trapping the evening commuters in a sea of red brake lights. Arthur's driver, a quiet man named Elias, glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting Arthur's cold, distant gaze. Elias knew better than to speak. He knew his employer lived in a world of silence. Arthur looked out the window, his breath hitching slightly as he saw the frost rimming the glass. And then, through the swirling sheets of wet, heavy snow, he saw them. Under a flickering street lamp that seemed to be gasping for its last breath of light, 2 small figures were huddled against a crumbling brick wall. They looked like discarded dolls in a city that had forgotten how to play. The boy, Leo, couldn't have been more than 10. His sister, Maya, was perhaps 6, her small frame nearly disappearing into the shadows of the alleyway. The snow was coming down in thick, suffocating waves, covering their hair in a layer of white. Even through the luxury sedan's heavy insulation, Arthur could see the boy trembling. It wasn't just a shiver. It was a violent, rhythmic vibration of the body trying to keep its core alive. Leo's teeth were chattering so hard that Arthur imagined he could hear the sound of bone hitting bone. Then something happened that shattered the ice around Arthur's heart. Without a moment of hesitation, Leo stood up. He reached for the buttons of his own threadbare denim jacket, his only layer of protection against the sub-zero temperatures. He peeled it off, exposing his thin chest covered only by a tattered t-shirt. He didn't look at the luxury cars idling just a few feet away. He didn't look at the skyscrapers in the distance. He only looked at Maya. With a tenderness that seemed impossible in such a brutal environment, he wrapped the jacket around his sister, tucking the collar under her chin. He pulled her close, shielding her small body with his own, whispering into her hair as he took the full force of the wind on his bare skin. In that single sacrificial act, Arthur Sterling didn't see 2 homeless children. He saw a mirror. He saw himself and Sarah on that porch in Queens. He saw the night he had tried to give Sarah his own sweater, only to have it ripped away by a system that didn't care about the warmth of a brother's love. The memory hit him like a physical blow, a surge of adrenaline and grief that he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in decades, the billionaire felt a spark of something other than calculated ambition. "Stop the car," Arthur commanded. his voice cracking. Elias hesitated, looking at the desolate neighborhood and the worsening storm. "Sir, it's not safe to step out here, and the traffic is—" "I said, stop the car," Arthur barked, already reaching for the door handle. Before Elias could even put the vehicle in park, Arthur was out in the blizzard. The wind hit him like a hammer, the cold biting into his expensive wool suit, but he didn't feel it. He didn't feel the sting of the ice on his face or the way the slush soaked into his handmade Italian shoes. He only felt the crushing weight of his own regret, a debt 40 years in the making that was suddenly demanding to be paid. As he approached the children, Leo's head snapped up. His eyes weren't filled with the hollow pleading of a beggar. They were wide with a mixture of terror and fierce predatory defiance. He stepped in front of Maya like a cornered wolf, his small hands balled into fists, his body still shaking uncontrollably. "Get away from us!" Leo shouted, his voice high and thin, lost almost instantly in the roar of the wind. Arthur stopped a few feet away, his chest heaving. He looked at the boy's bare arms, now turning a ghostly shade of purple. He looked at the girl, whose eyes were fixed on the glowing emblem of the Maybach, a world she couldn't even dream of inhabiting. Arthur didn't reach for his wallet. He didn't offer money or a lecture on the dangers of the street. Instead, he did something that would have shocked his board of directors to their core. He reached up and unbuttoned his own cashmere overcoat, a garment that cost more than most people earned in a year. He knelt in the dirty snow, the slush soaking into his trousers, and held the coat out. He didn't say a word. He couldn't. The tears had already begun to fall, hot and stinging, carving tracks through the frost on his cheeks. He wept for the boy he used to be, for the sister he had failed, and for the sheer brutal unfairness of a world where a child had to choose between his own survival and his sister's safety. Leo stared at the man in the expensive suit kneeling in the mud. He saw the genuine agony in Arthur's eyes, a pain that mirrored his own. Slowly, the boy's defensive posture softened. The cold was winning, and he knew it. He looked at his sister, then back at the stranger. Arthur draped the heavy, warm cashmere over Leo's shoulders, pulling both children toward him. For the first time in 40 years, the silent palace of Arthur Sterling's life was about to be filled with something other than shadows. But as he led them toward the car, he had no idea that this wasn't just a random act of kindness. He was about to discover that the past never truly stays buried, and that the children he had just saved were carrying a secret that would dismantle everything he thought he knew about his own life. The boy, Leo, clutched a small rusted tin box against his chest, refusing to let it go even as they entered the warmth of the Maybach. Inside that box lay the key to a darkness Arthur had unknowingly funded, and a locket that matched the one hidden in his office safe, a locket that belonged to a girl named Sarah. This was only the beginning of a war that would cost Arthur his fortune, but might finally save his soul. If you want to know what was inside that rusted box and how it connects to Arthur's lost sister, stay with me. The real story is just starting to thaw. If you're moved by this, subscribe and tell me in the comments, what would you sacrifice to save someone you love? Give this part a score from 0 to 10, and let's move forward. The interior of the Maybach was a cocoon of warmth, but for Leo and Maya, it felt like entering another planet. The leather smelled of expensive cedar and success, a scent so foreign to their nostrils that Maya began to sneeze, her small body still jolting from the aftershocks of the cold. Arthur sat across from them, his own cashmere coat now draped over the boy who had been willing to freeze for his sister. He watched them with a hunger he couldn't explain. He wasn't hungry for food, he was hungry for the truth of why this image, a boy, a girl and a sacrifice, had managed to pierce through a heart he thought had turned to granite years ago. As the car glided toward his sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city, the silence was heavy. Arthur noticed that Leo never let go of the rusted tin box. The boy held it against his chest with a white-knuckled grip, his eyes darting toward the tinted windows every time a pair of headlights flashed by. It wasn't the look of a child who was afraid of the dark. It was the look of a soldier who expected an ambush. Arthur wanted to speak, to offer some comfort, but what do you say to a child who has already seen the worst the world has to offer? But the warmth of the car was just a mask for a much colder truth that was about to emerge. When they finally pulled up to the iron gates of the Sterling estate, the house loomed like a fortress. It was a place built to keep people out, a monument to a man who didn't want to be touched. As the heavy doors of the mansion swung open, Arthur's housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, gasped at the sight of the disheveled trio. She didn't ask questions. She saw the look in Arthur's eyes, a look of desperate, raw humanity she hadn't seen in the 15 years she had worked for him. "Get the guest wing ready," Arthur commanded, his voice regaining its corporate steel but softened by an underlying tremor. "Hot baths, the softest clothes you can find, and soup, not the fancy kind, just warm soup. He carried Maya inside himself. She was so light, she felt like a bird with broken wings. Leo followed close behind, his eyes scanning the marble floors and the soaring ceilings, as if looking for the exits. He was a 10-year-old with the soul of an old man, a boy who had been forced to grow up in the shadows of a city that didn't care if he lived or died. As the children were led away to be bathed and fed, Arthur retreated to his study. It was a room filled with leather-bound books and shadows. He walked over to a small, hidden wall safe behind a portrait of his father. With shaking fingers, he punched in the code. Inside, resting on a velvet cushion, was a tarnished silver locket. It was the only thing he had kept from his childhood. He opened it to see the faded photograph of a young woman with a kind smile, Sarah. He had spent millions trying to find where she went after they were separated, but every lead had turned into a dead end. Every private investigator had eventually told him the same thing. Some people just disappear into the system, Mr. Sterling. It's like they were never there. He sat at his mahogany desk, the locket in his palm, feeling the weight of 40 years of failure. He thought he was the strongest man in Chicago, but tonight, a 10-year-old boy in a denim jacket had proven him a coward. Leo had stayed. Leo had fought. Arthur had merely succeeded. But the peace Arthur hoped to find by bringing them home was short-lived. A sudden crash from the guest wing shattered his reflection. He ran down the hallway to find Leo standing in the middle of a lavish bedroom, a broken porcelain vase at his feet. The boy was hyperventilating, the rusted tin box held like a shield. Mrs. Gable was standing near the door, looking helpless. "He won't let me take his clothes to wash them, sir," she whispered. "He started screaming when I tried to touch the box." Arthur stepped into the room, signaling for Mrs. Gable to leave. He sat on the edge of the bed, keeping a respectful distance. "Leo," he said softly, "you're safe here. No one is going to take anything from you. I give you my word." The boy looked at him, his eyes swimming with a mixture of exhaustion and a terrifyingly adult skepticism. "Everyone says that," Leo spat out, his voice cracking. "The people at the center said that. The man in the suit said that. But they always take everything. They took my mom, they took my grandma, they're not taking this." Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the blizzard outside. "Who is the man in the suit, Leo?" The boy didn't answer. Instead, his grip on the tin box loosened slightly as his exhaustion finally began to win the battle against his adrenaline. He sank onto the plush carpet, the box resting between his knees. "My grandma told me to keep it safe," he whispered, his head drooping. "She said it was our only way home. She said if the bad men found it, they'd make us disappear just like her." Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He watched as Leo's eyes fluttered shut, the boy finally succumbing to the warmth and the safety of the room. Moving as quietly as a shadow, Arthur reached out and gently slid the tin box away from the sleeping boy. He knew he was violating a trust, but a terrifying instinct was screaming at him that he needed to know what was inside. The hinges of the box groaned as he forced them open. Inside there were no toys, there were no candies, there were only papers, legal documents, birth certificates, and a stack of crumpled letters. But sitting right on top, wrapped in a piece of yellowed lace, was a tarnished silver locket. Arthur's breath stopped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own locket. He held them side by side under the lamp. They were identical. The same intricate floral engraving on the cover. The same slight dent on the left side, from when their father had dropped it during a drunken rage. With trembling hands, Arthur pried open the locket from the tin box. Inside was the same faded photograph of Sarah, but on the other side there was a newer photo, a woman who looked exactly like Sarah holding a baby. He began to sift through the papers, his vision blurring with tears. These weren't just random kids he had found in a storm. They were Sarah's grandchildren. Through the fragmented documents, the story began to assemble itself like a nightmare. Sarah hadn't just disappeared. She had lived a life of staggering hardship, never managing to break the cycle of poverty that the system had trapped her in. She had died only months ago in a state-run infirmary, leaving behind a daughter who had also struggled and passed away, leaving Leo and Maya alone. But it was the last document in the box that turned Arthur's blood to ice. It was a wardship agreement, a transfer of custody for Leo and Maya to a place called the Heritage Foundation. At the bottom of the page was a signature he recognized instantly. It was the signature of Silas Vane. Silas Vane was one of Arthur's closest professional associates. He was the director of the very foundation Arthur had donated over $50 million to over the last decade. It was supposed to be a charity that specialized in finding permanent homes for high-risk foster children. Arthur had stood on stages with Vane, shaking his hand for the cameras, believing he was finally doing something to help children like the ones he and Sarah had been. But as Arthur looked at the fine print of the legal documents, he saw the heir stripping clauses. Vane wasn't finding homes, he was finding children, who were the sole beneficiaries of small life insurance policies or unclaimed family properties, moving them into shadow facilities, and then using legal loopholes to funnel their inheritances into the Foundation's and his own accounts. Leo and Maya hadn't just been on the street, they were fugitives. They had fled one of Vane's facilities. Arthur realized with a sickening jolt that for years his checks had been paying for the very guards that Leo was so afraid of. His wealth hadn't been a tool for good, it had been the engine for the very misery that had nearly killed his own flesh and blood. He looked at the sleeping boy on the floor, the child who had sacrificed his jacket in the cold, and then he looked at the gold-framed photos of himself on the wall. He felt a wave of nausea. He had spent his life building a legacy of steel, only to find that the Foundation was built on the bones of the vulnerable. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," Arthur whispered into the silence of the room. "I'm so sorry." But Arthur Sterling wasn't a man who stayed down for long. The grief was quickly being replaced by a cold, calculating rage. He realized that Silas Vane wouldn't just let these children go. To Vane, Leo and Maya weren't children. They were loose ends. They were witnesses to the abuse and the corruption inside his charity. Arthur stood up, the lockets clutched in his hand. He knew what was coming. Vane would have realized by now that the children were missing. He would have his people looking for them. And if Vane found out that they were with Arthur, he would use every legal and illegal weapon in his arsenal to get them back. He would use Arthur's own reputation as a cold, detached billionaire to paint him as a kidnapper. The war was no longer about boardrooms or stock prices. It was a war for the lives of two children who had finally found the warmth they deserved. And Arthur Sterling was about to find out that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a man with $1 billion. It's a man with $1 billion who has nothing left to lose but his soul. But as he looked out the window at the snow, which was still falling relentlessly, he saw a black SUV pull up to his gate. It didn't have a visitor's pass. It didn't wait for an invitation. The headlights cut through the dark like the eyes of a predator. The hunt had begun, and Arthur knew that the blizzard was the least of their worries. He had to decide right now. Would he hide behind his lawyers, or would he become the man Leo thought he was when he took that coat in the snow? The choice was clear, but the cost would be higher than he ever imagined. If you want to see how Arthur faces the man he used to call a friend, and how a blue denim jacket becomes the ultimate symbol of a billionaire's redemption, stay tuned. The next part of this story will show you that sometimes to save a family, you have to destroy an empire. Tell me in the comments, do you think Arthur can truly redeem himself for the years he spent being blind? Subscribe, and let's find out together. The black SUV didn't just park. It loomed at the edge of Arthur's driveway like a vulture waiting for a heartbeat to stop. Silas Vane stepped out, his tailored charcoal suit a sharp contrast to the chaotic white of the swirling snow. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like the evening news version of a saint, composed, empathetic, and devastatingly professional. But Arthur, watching from the security monitors in his study, saw the truth. He saw the way Vane's eyes searched the windows of the mansion, not with concern for the children, but with the cold calculation of a man checking his inventory. The intercom crackled to life, Vane's voice smooth and honeyed. "Arthur, I know you're in there, and I know you have the children. I'm sure you think you're doing a noble thing, but you're in over your head. Those children are wards of the state, and I am their legal guardian. You're treading on very dangerous ground, my friend. Open the gates and we can settle this quietly. Don't make this something it doesn't have to be." Arthur's hand tightened around the silver locket in his pocket. He didn't answer. He watched the monitor as Vane signaled to a man in the passenger seat, a lawyer, no doubt, already recording the encounter for a future court filing. Arthur knew how this game was played. He had played it himself 1,000 times in the boardroom. If he didn't hand them over, Vane would call the police. He would claim Arthur was an unstable, grieving billionaire who had suffered a mental break and snatched 2 children off the street. Given Arthur's reputation for being cold and detached, the public would believe it. The headlines were already writing themselves. But the situation was about to get much worse. Within an hour, Arthur's private line, a number known only to his inner circle, began to ring incessantly. It was Marcus, the chairman of his board of directors. "Arthur, what the hell is going on? My phone is blowing up. There are reports that you've taken 2 kids from a Foundation facility. The stock is already sliding in the after-hours trading. People are talking about kidnapping. You need to turn those kids over to Vane immediately, or we're going to have to discuss an emergency vote for your removal." Arthur looked at the phone, Then at the door of the guest wing where Leo and Maya were finally sleeping in a bed with clean sheets, he felt a cold sweat prickle his neck. He was being squeezed from both sides. Vane had the law, and the board had his legacy. For 40 years, Arthur had defined himself by the height of his buildings and the strength of his stock price. Now, he was being told that to keep it all, he had to throw 2 children back into the mouth of a monster. He walked back into the guest room, his footsteps heavy on the plush carpet. Leo was awake. The boy was sitting up, the denim jacket clutched in his lap like a sacred relic. He didn't ask if the man at the gate was gone. He already knew. "He's here, isn't he?" Leo asked, his voice a ghost of a whisper. "The man with the silver tongue. He's going to take us back to the place with the locked doors." Arthur sat in a chair by the window, the moonlight reflecting off the snow and casting long skeletal shadows across the room. "Why did you run, Leo? Tell me the truth. Not just about the money, but about what happens inside those walls." Leo looked down at the jacket, his fingers tracing a jagged tear in the sleeve. "They don't see us as people, Mr. Sterling. We're just numbers. When my grandma died, they told us we were lucky. They said they were going to help us. But then they started asking about papers, about where Grandma kept her things, and when I wouldn't tell them, they put me in a room for 3 days without a window. I could hear Maya crying in the next room, and I couldn't get to her. There was a boy there, Toby. He tried to fight back once. They took him away to a special wing, and we never saw him again. I saw them hitting him, Mr. Sterling. They hit him until he stopped making noise." The words felt like shards of glass in Arthur's ears. He realized that for a decade, his charitable donations had been the fuel for this engine of cruelty. He hadn't been a philanthropist. He had been a financier for a child trafficking ring hidden behind the veneer of a non-profit. The guilt was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure in his chest. He looked at the denim jacket, the symbol of a boy's raw, sacrificial love, and then he looked at his own hands. They were clean, manicured, and utterly useless until this moment. "I won't let him take you," Arthur said, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't making a business promise. He was making a vow to his soul. But the morning brought a new level of desperation. By sunrise, a local news van was parked outside his gate, and a process server had arrived with an emergency court order. Vane had moved with terrifying speed. Arthur was officially being accused of interference with state custody. His lawyers were calling him, frantic, telling him that if he didn't comply within 12 hours, the police would be authorized to enter the estate by force. Arthur spent the morning in his library, the floor covered in the documents from Leo's tin box. He was looking for something, anything that could stop Vane's legal momentum. He found a name on a faded medical report from the infirmary where Sarah had died, Nurse Evelyn Vance. She was the one who had signed off on Sarah's final hours. Underneath her signature was a handwritten note, barely legible. "Patient insists on the box being given to the grandson. Admin tried to intercept. I hid it in the laundry." Arthur's eyes narrowed. This nurse had risked her job to make sure Leo got that tin box. She was a witness. But where was she now? He called his head of security, a man named Miller who had been with him for 20 years. "Find Evelyn Vance," Arthur commanded. "I don't care what it costs. I don't care if you have to wake up every retired nurse in the tri-state area." As the hours ticked away, the pressure inside the house became unbearable. The board of directors sent a final ultimatum: hand over the children by 5 p.m. or face an immediate vote of no confidence. Arthur's wealth was evaporating. His reputation was being dismantled in real time on the 24-hour news cycle, and the very foundation he had built was turning into his cage. He found himself standing in front of his office window, looking at the blue denim jacket, which he had moved to a display hook. It looked so small against the backdrop of his vast empire. He realized that Vane was counting on Arthur's greed. Vane believed that Arthur would never trade his billions for 2 orphans. Vane thought he knew Arthur because they were the same, men who valued power above all else. But Vane didn't know about the porch in Queens. He didn't know about the boy who had watched his sister disappear into a black car 40 years ago. "Sir," Miller's voice came over the line, sounding breathless, "we found her. Evelyn Vance. She's living in a small apartment in Gary, Indiana, but she's terrified, Arthur. She says Vane's people have been watching her for months. She has more than just memories. She has a ledger. She stole a copy of the Foundation's shadow books before she was fired." Arthur felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered by a grim reality. "The court hearing is in 4 hours, Miller. Get her here. I don't care if you have to hire a private jet or a tank. Just get her to the courthouse." Arthur walked into the living room where Leo and Maya were sitting together on a large sofa. looking lost in the middle of all that luxury. He knelt down in front of them, not as a billionaire, but as a man seeking forgiveness. "Leo, I need you to trust me one more time. We're going to a place where a lot of people are going to say bad things about me. They might even say bad things about you. But I need you to hold on to that box, and I need you to remember that I am not leaving you. Not this time." Leo looked at him, his small face pale but resolute. He reached out and touched Arthur's hand. "You're wearing the locket," the boy whispered. Arthur pulled the silver locket from his pocket. "It belonged to my sister, your grandmother. I lost her a long time ago, Leo. I spent my whole life building walls so I would never feel that pain again. But you showed me that the walls were the problem. The jacket was the strength. I'm ready to take mine off now." The turning point had arrived. Arthur Sterling was about to walk into a courtroom where he would likely lose his company, his status, and his freedom. He was going to admit to his own negligence, to the fact that his money had funded a criminal enterprise. He was going to burn his own legacy to the ground to ensure that Vane was caught in the fire. But as they prepared to leave, the front gates of the estate were suddenly swarmed, not just by Vane's people, but by the police. The 12 hours were up. The flashing blue and red lights reflected off the marble foyer, a silent alarm that the time for talk was over. Vane was standing at the front of the line, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He thought he had won. He thought the billionaire would finally fold. Arthur picked up Maya and took Leo by the hand. He didn't look at the police. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked at the denim jacket hanging on the wall and felt a warmth that no heater could ever provide. "Let's go," he said, his voice a low growl of defiance. "We have a date with the truth." The climax of this journey is approaching, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Will the nurse arrive in time with the proof Arthur needs, or will Vane's web of lies be too strong to break? Watch the final part to see how a man who had everything finally discovers what it means to be truly rich. Tell me in the comments, do you believe one person can really take down a system as corrupt as this? Subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion of this incredible story. Give this part a score from 0 to 10. I'm reading every word you write. The courthouse was a tomb of cold marble and echoing whispers, a place where the truth was often buried under layers of legal jargon and expensive stationery. Outside, Chicago was once again paralyzed by a blizzard, the wind howling against the tall windows as if trying to break in and finish what it had started on that street corner weeks ago. Silas Vane sat at the plaintiff's table, looking every bit the picture of a concerned philanthropist. He wore a suit that cost more than a teacher's yearly salary, and his expression was one of practiced, sorrowful disappointment. He looked at the gallery, where reporters were scribbling furiously, and then he looked at Arthur. Vane's lead attorney stood up, his voice ringing through the silent room. "Your Honor, we are here today to address a tragedy. Arthur Sterling, a man whose contributions to our city are well known, has clearly suffered a psychological collapse. In his grief over a long-lost sister, he has snatched 2 wards of the state from the street. He is keeping them in his home against every legal mandate. We ask for the immediate return of Leo and Maya to the Heritage Foundation, where they can receive the professional care they so desperately need." Arthur sat at the defense table, but he wasn't looking at the judge. He was looking at Leo and Maya, who were sitting in the front row, flanked by 2 of Arthur's security guards. Leo was clutching the rusted tin box so hard his knuckles were white. Arthur felt the weight of the board's ultimatum in his pocket, a document stating that if he didn't hand the children over today, he would be stripped of his position as CEO of Sterling Industries by nightfall. His empire was on the line. His legacy was a flickering candle in a hurricane. When it was Arthur's turn to speak, he didn't let his lawyers take the lead. He stood up slowly, the joints in his knees popping, a reminder that he was no longer the young man who had laid bricks in the sun. He walked to the center of the courtroom, not with the swagger of a billionaire, but with the heavy tread of a man who had finally stopped running. "I didn't kidnap those children," Arthur began, his voice low and raspy. "I found them. I found them because they were running for their lives. And they weren't running from the cold. They were running from the very man who claims to be their guardian." Vane scoffed, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "Mr. Sterling, your delusions are—" "I was blind," Arthur interrupted, his voice rising, cutting through the room like a blade. "For 10 years I wrote checks to the Heritage Foundation. I thought I was buying redemption. I thought I was helping children like the one I used to be. But what I was actually doing was funding a slaughterhouse of souls. I was paying for the locked doors, for the shadow facilities, and for the lawyers who helped Silas Vane strip children of their inheritances. I am not standing here to defend my actions. I am standing here to confess my negligence." The room went deathly silent. Arthur turned to look directly at Vane. I am submitting into evidence the contents of this tin box, but more importantly, I am submitting the forensic accounting of my own company. I realized that the Heritage Foundation wasn't just taking money from me. They were using my corporate accounts to hide their shadow transactions. I've opened every book I own. I've exposed every secret of Sterling Industries to the federal investigators. If that means I lose my company, so be it. But Silas Vane is not leaving this room a free man. At that moment, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Miller, Arthur's head of security, stepped inside, supporting an older woman who looked pale but determined. It was Evelyn Vance. She held a black ledger against her chest as if it were a shield. Vane's face transformed in an instant. The mask of the philanthropist shattered, revealing a raw, jagged terror. He tried to stand to say something, but the words died in his throat. "This is Evelyn Vance," Arthur said, his voice now a calm, steady thunder. "She was the nurse who watched my sister, Sarah, die in a state-run infirmary. She's the one who ensured these children escaped with their history. And she has the records that prove Vane has been embezzling millions from the state's foster care budget for over a decade." The next hour was a blur of chaos and justice. Evelyn's testimony was the final nail in the coffin. She described the abuse, the isolation, and the way Vane's people would target children who had nobody left to fight for them. She produced the shadow ledger, a detailed map of Vane's offshore accounts, and the names of the board members who had looked the other way. As the judge reviewed the documents, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It was no longer a hearing about a billionaire's mental health. It was a crime scene. 2 federal agents, who had been waiting in the back of the room, stepped forward. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound Arthur had ever heard. Silas Vane, the man who had lived in the light of Arthur's wealth, was led away in silence, his head bowed, his public image disintegrating with every step. But the real victory didn't happen when the handcuffs closed. It happened when the judge looked at Arthur and the children. In light of the evidence of systemic abuse and the biological connection established by the documents in the tin box, the judge said, her voice softening, "I am granting temporary emergency custody of Leo and Maya to Arthur Sterling, pending a full investigation into the Foundation's activities." As Arthur walked out of the courthouse, the blizzard was still raging, but for the first time in 40 years, he didn't feel the cold. He felt a hand slip into his. He looked down to see Leo looking up at him. The boy didn't say anything, but the look of terror was gone. In its place was a flicker of something Arthur had almost forgotten existed: trust. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Arthur was indeed ousted as CEO of Sterling Industries. The board, terrified of the scandal, tried to distance themselves from him. He lost his office, his stock plummeted, and he became the subject of 100 different documentaries. But he didn't care. He spent his days in the guest wing of his mansion, which was quickly being transformed into a place of life. There were toys on the marble floors now. There were finger paintings on the glass walls. The silence that had once defined his life was replaced by the sound of Maya's laughter and Leo's curiosity. Arthur used the remains of his personal fortune to dismantle the Heritage Foundation piece by piece. He worked with the authorities to ensure every child Vane had tucked away was found and placed in a legitimate home. He turned his penthouse, the mausoleum of glass and steel, into the headquarters for a new advocacy group, one run by people like Evelyn Vance, who actually cared about the children they served. Fast forward to 3 months later. It was spring in Chicago. The snow had finally melted, revealing the green life that had been waiting beneath the ice all along. The city felt different, softer, more vibrant. Arthur, Leo, and Maya were sitting on a wooden bench in the park. Maya was wearing a new, warm yellow coat, her hair tied back in bright ribbons. She was focused on a butterfly that had landed on a nearby flower. Arthur looked at Leo. The boy was wearing a clean shirt and brand new shoes, but he had his old blue denim jacket draped over the back of the bench. It was faded and torn, a relic of a time when he had to be a hero just to survive the night. Arthur realized that while he had spent 40 years building a fortune, he only became truly wealthy the moment he stopped his car in that blizzard. He had traded a company for a family, and it was the best deal he had ever made. "Arthur," Leo asked, looking at the silver locket that now hung around Maya's neck, polished and shining in the afternoon sun, "do you think Grandma Sarah knows we're safe?" Arthur looked up at the blue sky, feeling a warmth that came from deep within his chest. "I think she's the one who sent the snow, Leo, just to make sure I'd stop the car. True legacy isn't written in bank statements or carved into the sides of skyscrapers. It's written in the warmth we provide for those who have nothing. It's found in the moment we realize that our greatest strength isn't what we have, but what we are willing to give away. Arthur Sterling, the Man of Steel, had finally found his home, and as Maya laughed, chasing the butterfly into the grass, the silver locket caught the light, shining like a promise that would never be broken again. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel to support more narratives like this. Your support means the world to me, and please, leave a comment below with a rating from 0 to 10 for Arthur and Leo's journey. I read every single one of your messages. Thank you for watching until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.